Hi, this video is about cellular injury. Usually when a cell undergoes stress, it leads to growth adaptations such as hyperplasia, hypertrophy, dysplasia, atrophy, or metaplasia. Cellular injury occurs when the stress is so severe and exceeds the cell's ability to adapt. The likelihood of injury depends on the type of stress, its severity, and also on the type of cell affected. So in terms of the type of cell involved, for example, neurons are highly susceptible to ischemic injury. That is why, for example, the brain can only survive a few minutes without oxygen when there is reduced blood supply to the brain. On the other hand, skeletal muscle is relatively more resistant. So that is why in athletes, muscles can easily adapt to intense stress by undergoing hypertrophy, and when there is reduced blood supply to the muscle for a prolonged period of time, the muscles undergo atrophy. In terms of the severity of the stress, when the blood supply to, say, the kidney is slowly reduced, for example, in the case of atherosclerosis of the renal artery, the kidney undergoes atrophy. On the other hand, when blood supply to the kidney is completely cut off all of a sudden, for example, in an embolus of the renal artery, the kidney will undergo acute ischemia, and that will lead to an infarction of the renal parenchyma. Common causes of cellular injury include inflammation, nutritional deficiency or excess, as well as hypoxia, trauma, and genetic mutations. Now let's focus on tissue hypoxia. So cells, and for that matter tissue, depend on oxygen in order to generate energy in the form of ATP. So low oxygen delivery to the tissue, which is also called tissue hypoxia, means that there would be reduced generation of energy, and when the cells lack energy, their normal functions will be disrupted. Now let's break this down a bit. So in oxidative phosphorylation, there is transfer of electrons. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Therefore, decreased oxygen impairs oxidative phosphorylation, because without oxygen, the electron transport chain is incomplete. Now, oxidative phosphorylation is essential in the production of ATP. So when oxidative phosphorylation is impaired, there would be reduced generation of ATP, in other words, energy. ATP is essential in cellular processes like protein synthesis, the sodium-potassium pump, as well as the calcium pump. So lack of ATP therefore leads to cellular injury. Now, some causes of hypoxia include ischemia, hypoxemia, and decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Now let's delve into each of these causes. So we start with ischemia. Ischemia can be defined as decreased blood flow through an organ. Let's illustrate this briefly with a capillary. So the arterial system and the venous system are connected by the capillary network. The capillary network is where exchange of gases takes place. So in other words, that is where oxygen coming from the arterial system is absorbed into the tissue, and carbon dioxide is given off or is transported into the venous drainage. Let's take an example. In coronary atherosclerosis, the arteries of the heart are narrowed because of plaque formation, which is made up of fat within the lumen of the arteries. Now this causes reduced blood flow through the coronary arteries, therefore reducing blood supply to the heart. And so we can also say that because blood supply to the heart is reduced, then oxygen supply to the heart or the heart muscle is also reduced. This same plaque within the lumen of the coronary arteries can rupture, and when it ruptures, it leads to serious complications. So as a second example, we can use Budd-Chiari syndrome. So Budd-Chiari syndrome is a very rare condition affecting 1 in a million adults. It is caused by occlusion of or the blockage of the hepatic veins that drain the liver. It usually presents with the classical triad of abdominal pain, ascites, and liver enlargement or hepatomegaly. Now, Budd-Chiari syndrome has many causes, one of which is polycythemia vera or excessive red blood cells. Now, excessive red blood cells leads to a more viscous blood, which increases the risk for clot formation and thrombosis of the hepatic vein. Now, thrombosis of the hepatic vein is going to block the blood vessel or the blood flow to the liver, leading to ischemia as well as hypoxia of the liver parenchyma. Eventually, this whole process is going to cause shock or is going to lead to shock due to generalized hypotension and poor tissue perfusion. Now, let's move on to hypoxemia. So hypoxemia can be defined as low partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood below 60 millimeters of mercury, as well as an oxygen saturation of red blood cells less than 90%. The normal sequence of oxygen movement from the atmosphere to the red blood cells in arterial circulation is as follows. So atmospheric pressure of oxygen translates as partial pressure of alveolar oxygen, which in turn translates as partial pressure of arterial oxygen, and finally into oxygen saturation of the red blood cells. Therefore, if the partial pressure of alveolar oxygen is reduced as a result of, let's say, disease of the lungs, then the partial pressure of oxygen or arterial oxygen will be affected. Hypoxemia can arise under the following circumstances. At high altitude, there is decreased barometric pressure, and this will result in decreased partial pressure of alveolar oxygen, as well as reduced partial pressure of arterial oxygen. In hypoventilation, there is increased partial pressure of alveolar carbon dioxide, which means that there will be decreased partial pressure of alveolar oxygen. This reduces the partial pressure of arterial oxygen, leading to hypoxemia. In ventilation perfusion mismatch, also known as the VQ mismatch, blood bypasses oxygenated lung due to circulation problem, for example, in the case of right to left shunt due to ventricular septal defect, atrial septal defect, pneumonia, and atelectasis. This mismatch can also occur when, let's say, oxygenated air cannot reach the blood due to ventilation problems such as asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, pulmonary embolism, and parenchymal disease of the lungs. In diffusion defects such as interstitial pulmonary fibrosis and pulmonary arterial hypertension, the partial pressure of alveolar oxygen is normal, but is not able to push as much oxygen into the blood due to a thicker diffusion barrier. Therefore, the partial pressure of arterial oxygen is reduced. Now let's look at hypoxia due to decreased oxygen carrying capacity. So decreased oxygen carrying capacity arises with hemoglobin loss or dysfunction. For example, in anemia, there is decreased red blood cell mass. So the partial pressure of arterial oxygen is normal, and the oxygen saturation of red blood cells is also normal. However, the problem is with hemoglobin. Because red blood cell mass is decreased, concentration of hemoglobin available within the red blood cell to bind oxygen is reduced. Now, each hemoglobin can bind maximum of 4 oxygen molecules. Carbon monoxide binds hemoglobin more avidly than oxygen. So, carbon monoxide usually displaces oxygen and takes up all the binding spaces available. Therefore, in carbon monoxide poisoning, partial pressure of arterial oxygen is normal, but the oxygen saturation of red blood cells is reduced, and that causes hypoxia. Sources of exposure to carbon monoxide include smoke from fires and exhaust from cars. So in a person or in a patient with carbon monoxide poisoning, the classical findings include cherry red appearance of the skin, and in early exposure, the patient or the person might complain about a headache. Significant exposure to carbon monoxide can lead to coma and sometimes death. Another cause of hypoxia is methemoglobinemia. Normally, iron binds to oxygen in the Fe2 plus state. However, in methemoglobinemia, iron in heme is oxidized to Fe3 plus, which cannot bind oxygen. Therefore, the partial pressure of arterial oxygen is normal, but the oxygen saturation of red blood cell is reduced. So less oxygen is delivered to the body tissue, and hence hypoxia ensues. Methemoglobinemia can be seen with oxidant stress involving the use of sulfur and nitrate drugs, as well as in newborns. So the physiological system of adults is capable of converting iron back to its Fe2 plus state with the use of antioxidants and enzymes. However, the antioxidant mechanisms of newborns are not fully functional yet, so newborns are more susceptible to methemoglobinemia. Classic findings in methemoglobinemia is cyanosis with chocolate-colored blood. Methemoglobinemia can be treated with intravenous methylene blue, which helps reduce Fe3 plus back to the Fe2 plus state so that it can bind oxygen. So we said in the beginning that hypoxia impairs oxidative phosphorylation, resulting in decreased ATP production. And by the way, oxidative phosphorylation takes place within the mitochondria of cells. So low ATP actually disrupts key cellular functions, including the sodium-potassium pump, which results in the buildup of sodium and water within the cell. Also, there is disruption of the calcium pump, which results in buildup of calcium within the cytosol of the cell, and that could lead to random activation of enzymes. Also, there is disruption of aerobic glycolysis, which results in a switch to anaerobic glycolysis. Now, anaerobic glycolysis means that there's going to be a buildup of lactic acid and also lowering of the pH. Now, this leads to the proteins being denatured and also DNA being precipitated. Now, the initial phase of injury is reversible, and a hallmark of reversible injury is cellular swelling. So there is cytosol swelling, and this cytosol swelling results in loss of microvilli as well as membrane blebbing. So if there is loss of microvilli and membrane blebbing in the, let's say, the enterocytes of the small intestines, then that will inhibit the ability of the enterocytes to absorb nutrients. Now, the swelling of the there's also swelling of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and this leads to dissociation of the ribosomes from the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Now, the rough endoplasmic reticulum is responsible for protein synthesis. So, since there is dissociation of the ribosomes, that it means that protein synthesis in the rough endoplasmic reticulum is also going to be impaired. So, eventually, the damage becomes irreversible. The hallmark of irreversible injury is membrane damage. So there is plasma membrane damage, and plasma membrane damage results in cytosolic enzymes leaking into the serum, and that is an indication of irreversible cellular injury. So for example, in myocardial infarction, a blood sample is taken, and cardiac enzymes such as troponin is measured or is looked out for within the blood sample, and that is an indication of irreversible cellular injury, because in that state, that it means that if the troponins are high within the serum, then that would indicate that the plasma membrane of the cardiac myocyte has been damaged, and that is an indication of irreversible injury to the myocardium. Also, since the calcium pump is damaged, then it means that there's going to be lack or deficiency in ATP, and additional calcium is able to enter the cytosol due to the disruption of the pump, and when they enter the cytosol, they end up activating enzymes randomly. Now, there is also damage to the mitochondrial membrane, and damage to the mitochondrial membrane results in loss of electron transport chain, which occurs within the inner mitochondrial membrane during oxidative phosphorylation. Now, ATP production takes place in oxidative phosphorylation as a result of oxidative phosphorylation. So, if there is loss of the electron transport chain, then it means that ATP production will be inhibited. Also, cytochrome C together with other pro-apoptotic proteins leak into the cytosol, and when they leak into the cytosol, they get activated, and when they get activated, that is going to kickstart the apoptotic mechanism, or the programmed cell death, which is apoptosis. Finally, lysosome membrane damage results in hydrolytic enzymes leaking into the cytosol, and they end up being activated by the high intracellular calcium. Now, the end result of irreversible injury is cell death. Thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. More videos coming up. See you in the next one.